We're going to take a look now at this log from brolio. One of the things brolio mentions is that the pitch I gain is basically only acting as a PID sum increase. And let's take a look at that. Let's go ahead and bring up the pitch PID, and we'll take a look at the I term. And what we can see is that here, as you use arm, notice that the pitch I term is 0 at the beginning. And as you begin to throttle up and fly, pitch I goes positive. And if we zoom out, you can see that it stays positive the entire flight. That is normal. So when you're in forward flight, for whatever reason, probably some aerodynamic effect, there is some kind of a persistent bias, if you could call it, a persistent force that is pushing the copter to pitch backwards. And the I term is doing its job correctly in counteracting that. So if it weren't for this I term going positive, you would be constantly having to nudge the pitch stick forward in flight to keep the copter from pitching back. And the I term is doing that for you. There are two questions we could ask about this, and one of them is, why is that? And I'll tell you the real answer is I don't know. When I first noticed this, I explored changing the CG of the copter to see if that would fix it. And my CG was a little bit aft of center, so I moved the battery forward to make the CG be like dead center or maybe a little bit even forward of center, and it didn't change it at all. The other thing you notice is that if you actually just do a flat hover, and I suggest doing this line of sight because it's sometimes a little hard to hover FPV, especially if you have up tilt on your camera, but just do a flat hover. And what you'll see is that the I term is very, very close to 0 in a flat hover, which again, if it was a CG issue, you would see that the I term would be positive or negative in a flat hover. And it probably is a little bit because your CG is probably not perfectly centered, but it's barely affected at all. And then as soon as you go into forward flight, the pitch I term goes positive. And by the way, if you ever, again, you might try this line of sight because it's a little hard to do FPV. If you fly nose out and you fly backwards, right, towards yourself, you'll see that the I term goes negative. And I haven't tested this, but I believe that if you translate left, in other words, fly to the left but keep your nose out, you'll see the same thing happen in the roll. And I believe that there's an aerodynamic effect going on here. There is some interaction between probably the props. Uh, I've heard it suggested that the props that are high and back a little bit. So in other words, if you're flying forward, it's the back two props, that they are interacting with the turbulent air that is interacting with the front props. So the front props are getting clean air and the back props are getting slightly dirty air. And that results in them generating slightly less thrust. And that means that they need to spin slightly faster in order to keep the copter stable. I don't know about all that, but I can tell you that this is completely normal. Seeing your pitch I term positive in forward flight is completely normal. It's doing its job. It's not a problem. Don't worry about it. It is interesting, though, because there's another topic that people have been talking about, and that is the pitch coupling to the throttle. Whereas you throttle up, the copter changes its pitch attitude slightly. And I think that these two things are probably related, because I think that we're going to see if there is an aerodynamic effect that's going on here where something about the way the air coming from the front props is affecting the back props' ability to generate thrust, then it makes sense that that would be better or worse as the throttle changes, right? As the motors spin up, the air would get more turbulent and maybe the back motors would have to spin faster. So I think that there's probably a relationship between this positive pitch I term and the pitch coupling that we see between the throttle and the pitch axis. And I don't know what it is, but if I wanted to, thankfully, I'm not having this problem right now. My copter holds attitude pretty well, so I'm not inclined to go start trying to, dig into it. But if I did want to troubleshoot this, one thing I might look at is the distance between the props. In other words, is the problem better or worse on a 180 frame versus a 250 or a 330. And the size of the props. Is the problem better or worse with 6-inch versus 5-inch props? A prop with a larger prop disc is going to have a larger sort of area of turbulent air that it is affecting, whereas a prop with a smaller pitch is going to have less. It may also relate to the shape of the props. Bullnose props are going to have a lot worse tip vortices than a prop with a rounded tip. And maybe something about that turbulent air around the thrust column is making this problem worse. So is this problem worse with bullnose versus non-bullnose props, etc. High pitch versus low pitch props, etc. That's the direction I would explore if I really wanted to troubleshoot this issue. But if you're not having pitch coupling with your throttle, in other words, when you change your throttle, if your copter stays pretty stable on the pitch axis, don't worry about the fact that your I term is positive because it's just doing its job. It's not a big deal. Okay, so don't worry about that. Another thing you say is that the traces look really noisy on the D term, and you are running Betaflight. And I've noticed that the Betaflight D term looks way noisier than the D term did on the Betaflight V2 than it did on Betaflight V1. On Betaflight V1, we had a very, very low cutoff frequency, maybe between 10 and 20 hertz on the D term filter, and the D term traces could get to look pretty smooth. Whereas here, we can definitely see that there's some high frequency noise in here. And what I mean by high frequency noise, for those who may not know, is if we imagine sort of averaging this line out, we could imagine a sort of a smooth line through here. But there's all these little uppy downy wiggles and jiggles here, and that's a higher frequency signal that's sort of imposed on top of the lower frequency D term. Um, and I've just on Betaflight, I've seen this more and more. So I don't think this is a problem because we all know that Betaflight flies great. So with Betaflight V1, we thought that what we needed to do was filter the D term very heavily in order to get good flight performance. And with Betaflight V2, we have remember Betaflight V1 had two filters. There was the gyro filter, and then there was the D term filter, and they were both applied, one after the other. With Betaflight V2, we have the gyro filter and the D-term filter, but the gyro filter is much, much more effective, and so we can get away with less D-term filtering. And long story short, I don't think this is a problem. So don't worry about this as long as your copter's flying fine. In terms of your D-term looks pretty decent here in terms of its overall magnitude relative to the P-term. Notice that in general, the D-term is a little bit smaller than or maybe about the same size as the P-term. We're not seeing any cases where the D-term is, whoa, going crazy while the P-term and yanking the P-term around. So we want to kind of see them doing a little dance in sync with each other. We don't want to see one of them flipping out and the other one getting dragged around. And so this looks like actually a reasonably good D-term tune, in as much as I'm able to judge your D-term without actually seeing a flight video and flying your copter. This doesn't strike me as completely out of whack, right? So here's a case, your P-term rises, but your D-term doesn't go crazy. And if we, again, here, D-term is generally just a little less than, or they're sort of nice and tame. So I feel like your D-term is fine here. One thing about the high frequency noise, when everybody started flying Betaflight, everybody started flying 1,000 loop time. And that means that your black box logging, a lot of people are going from 1-to-1 logging to 1-to-2 logging. Your black box rate denom goes to 2. It is worth knowing that anytime you're undersampling like that, you will get aliasing noise. And this hasn't been something I've explored very much until now, at least in part because people were more likely to be running 1-to-1 logging when we were on previous versions of Betaflight, where we could run a 2,000 loop time or something like that. If you are seeing high frequency noise like this and you're curious about it, try switching to 1-to-1 logging. You may not be able to do 1-to-1 logging if you've got an open log device. They can keep up with 1,000 loop time, but you will get a lot of gaps sometimes. But if you've got an onboard data flash chip, you should be doing 1-to-1 logging. And I realize that means you may only get 2 or 3 minutes of logging at most, but those data flash chips are super fast, so you don't need to worry about speed. And the removal of aliasing from the one-to-one logging will definitely be worth it in terms of knowing that you're really seeing what's there instead of seeing aliasing noise. And when you talk about aliasing noise, especially at low throttle, these little things here, I've heard it suggested, Boris has suggested that that's aliasing noise, that just can't be legit stuff that's going on in the gyro. I would be very interested, and maybe I'll do this if I find the time and the inclination. I would be very interested to see the difference in something like this, just a normal flat hover with a slow throttle up, see what that looks like with one-to-one logging versus 1-to-2 or 1-to-3 logging. So that may be some of the high frequency noise that you're seeing here. Could be. Only a test would tell us for sure. Last thing is you asked about the bounce back at the end of the flip in this log. Let's take a look here. So let's get RC command in here as well. Definitely want to see RC command. Okay. Nope. Hang on. Okay. So now we've got RC command and the gyro on top and the PID on the bottom. And we see that the pitch stick goes negative, pushing into the flip, gyro goes negative. We see that the gyro and the RC command are tracking each other pretty well. Here we see that the flip ends, RC command comes back to center. The gyro again tracks pretty well. Notice that the gyro hits 0 just slightly after the RC command hits 0. I mean, they're never going to be completely in sync. There's, it's a real world system that has some inertia and so forth. But that's pretty darn good in terms of how quickly the gyro hits 0 relative to the RC command. We do see that there's a little bit of oscillation at the end. There is no bounce back because the gyro never crosses the line. So what we have happening here is that the copter ends the move slightly early and then pushes in and a little forward. So it's a stuttering at the end of the move, but not an overshoot and bounce back, which would be if the gyro crossed the line. And then here the gyro does cross the line, but I think you've just moved on to the next, you're flying now. So if we take a look at what your PID is doing here, we see that as the move begins, the P term pushes into the move. It goes the same direction as the gyro. So the P term is accelerating the move and then pushes against the move to slow it down. And then it's pushing to accelerate the move again because the gyro is negative and the P term is negative, same side. It's accelerating the move here up until the end where it tries to slow the move down, and there's a little bit of bounciness here. It's possible that you could get a more aggressive slowing of the move by increasing your P gain, but I don't know about that. Honestly, this looks probably perfect on the high def video. I doubt you can really see this little oscillation, and the fact that there's no overshoot and bounce back means it probably isn't much to complain about. I do want to take 1 second before my time runs out and just mention you're on PID controller 2. Your pitch P gain is 2.3. Your roll P gain is 1.8. Those are a little higher than most people are running, but you're on 3S, and that explains it. 3S is going to have higher P gains. I also noticed that your pitch or your pitch I gain and your roll I gain are almost the same, and that's a little suspicious. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it's usually the case that I gain is also a little higher on pitch than on roll. So if I look at a tune and I see that they're the same, I think you probably haven't finished tuning those, that either I on pitch needs to come up or I on roll needs to come down. So something to look at. All right, I hope that's helpful, and happy flying.